We are now going to start looking at the Korean War. This is important because it's really the first armed conflict of the Cold War, but as we know, the whole goal here is to avoid the United States and the Soviet Union from fighting each other because we both have nuclear weapons and that's the end of the world. Right? So where are we talking about? We're talking about Korea, so if we're looking at a map of the entire world, we should know that the United States is here. We should know this would say Soviet Union if this was a map of the world during the Cold War. We're going to focus our attention right here on North Korea, South Korea, all right? So, just a little bit of background. Once again, here's North Korea, here's South Korea, right? All throughout the first half of the 20th century, right, Japan is going to control Korea, all right? Starts off as a colony. Obviously, it has a history just like any, pretty much any country, right? But for the immediate period before the Cold War, they were under Japanese rule. So here would be Japan here. So we know that Japan expands throughout the Pacific, right? So one of the first places that they invade and take over is the Korean Peninsula. Right, now what happens is after World War II, when the United States is fighting Japan, the Soviet Union gets involved, right? The Allies, and in this case, the Soviet Union and the United States are both going to take control of Korea. And they're actually going to split it in half right here at the 38th parallel. And the Soviet Union, so the USSR, let me get a different color so that it stands out. Right, so the USSR is going to take control and occupy the lands north of that, and the United States is going to take control and occupy the lands to the south of that. And as you can imagine, that's not going to make the Korean people very happy. So we do have instances of protest and revolts. Right? Now this is kind of like the next piece of just like kind of the first video where we had the different steps. Right? Now we're going to look at the influence that Korea has, right, during the early stages of the Cold War from its neighbor, China. Right? From 1945 to 1949, China is going to have its own civil war. It's going to have communist forces going against nationalist forces, which would want a little bit more democracy. And then that fighting is going to kind of, the mindset is going to find its way spreading into Korea, right? So if you're looking at the communist forces, they're going to be led by Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Communist Party in China, right? And then the nationalist forces are going to be led by General Chiang Kai-shek, right? Obviously, you can tell by the colors, the United States is going to support or send military aid to the nationalists, and that leaves the Soviet Union to send troops to, or send military aid to the communists fighting, right? The communists end up winning. China then becomes a standalone Chinese or a communist country. Obviously, the Soviet Union is communist as well, but China kind of stands by themselves. They don't really rely as heavily on the Soviet Union as some of the other satellites do that we've talked about in previous videos. Right? So that mindset is now going to trickle into the Korean Peninsula. All right, where North Korea is going to be supported by the Soviet Union and the dictator there. They're both dictators, which is kind of weird, right? But the whole idea of the United States wanting to stop communism from spreading. So the Soviet Union is going to support Kim Il-sung, who's the first dictator of North Korea, and the United States is going to support Syngman Rhee, right, who was also a dictator as well, but he wasn't communist, so that's why the U.S. supported him. All right, so what happens is in 1950, the forces in North Korea are going to invade South Korea, and basically the U.S. kind of stands by South Korea, and China and the Soviet Union support North Korea. Right, very hands-off at first, kind of like verbal support. Right, and then we start getting into the military action. Then you're going to start seeing troops and military aid. So the whole idea of North Korea wanted to invade South Korea to unite and have one communist Korea, right? People in South Korea fighting back. Right. At first, the United States obviously doesn't want to get involved because if we get involved, that'll lead to the Soviet Union getting involved. And once again, that's nuclear war. So the United States asked the United Nations to get involved. Right, a newly formed peacekeeping organization. This was kind of their first attempt to prevent world war or prevent some kind of conflict around the world. So UN troops are sent in, but here's kind of an interesting note: 88% of the troops that fight are American soldiers. So it kind of is the United States fighting in this war to help the South Koreans. General Douglas MacArthur, is named the UN commander, right? That's this guy here, right? He's going to be responsible for trying to help preserve the stalemate or preserve the status quo in the Korean Peninsula. Right now, in terms of the actual battles, right, there's just probably one big battle you need to know, but I want you to look at this map because this map right here tells the story of the Korean War. Right, so you got your key down here. The yellow is going to be the communist forces area that they control. The green is going to be the area controlled by the UN forces, and then you got your red arrows and your blue arrows, and we know that red is the Soviet Union. So if we start early on, okay, obviously the communist forces are going to be overwhelmingly victorious. They are expanding into South Korea, and the Allies are pretty much pushed almost to the edge of the South Korean peninsula there. Right? Then this would be the major battle that you need to know. It's the Incheon Peninsula. By the time the United States gets UN troops there, they kind of organize themselves. They make this big, massive push. They cross over the 38th parallel. And then if you look carefully, what country are they heading towards, right, as they get closer up here towards the tip of North Korea? They're getting close to China, which we know China is communist because of the communist revolution. So now the United States has a problem. If they continue and try to wipe out all of the communist forces in Korea, what do they risk happening? They risk having China then get involved. So China actually does send troops, and it becomes a really awkward conflict because you don't want the Soviet Union to get involved because at this point they are in the midst of nuclear weapons as well. So now with the help of communist China, the UN troops are going to be pushed back before finally an armistice or a ceasefire. That's where they temporarily agree to stop fighting. So a ceasefire is agreed at the 38th parallel once again, so they're roughly able to keep the status quo. All right, so technically, this war is still going on, and that's why everybody is always concerned about the dictatorship in North Korea, right, and the democracy, the democratic government in South Korea, because a state of war kind of still exists, right, all throughout the Korean Peninsula. Right, now, just some behind-the-scenes things, right? We know that Harry Truman is still president since FDR has passed away. MacArthur wants to go a step further, right? And he wants to use atomic weapons, once again, on China, because China's communist, and we want to stop the spread of communism. But Truman kind of is a little bit wiser, and he realizes that if we use nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union is then going to be forced to get involved because that's another communist country as well. So you do have a lot of arguing, of tension between General MacArthur and Harry Truman. Ultimately, Harry Truman, as commander-in-chief, fires MacArthur, right? And then when Truman finishes his term, General Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected president. You should remember him from D-Day. He was the commander of Allied forces, right? And he sets about trying to end the war quickly with the demilitarized armistice line between North Korea and South Korea.